Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. Last week we discussed the launch of the so-called party-wide thematic education campaign to study and implement Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, and the subsequent Politburo study session on the topic. On Saturday, we did a deep dive into this high-level political campaign and its possible implications. Yesterday, Monday, the party kicked off this ideological campaign with a working conference. According to state-run Xinhua, at this conference, General Secretary Xi Jinping expressed that the campaign should be an opportunity to further arm all party members with the party's new theories and enhance their understanding of Marxism, calling on party members to strive together to fully build a modern socialist China and realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The new head of the Central Committee General Office, Cai Qi, is also head of the central leading group for this campaign. At the event's closing speech yesterday, Cai expressed, quote, "The education campaign should guide party members and officials in improving their capacity for political judgment, thinking, and implementation to build the party into one piece of iron that is invincible. All party members must attentively study and fully implement Xi's speech and tirelessly forge their soul with Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era." End quote. The campaign is set to be held throughout the month of April, and we will cover any salient developments as they occur. Next up, Japan's Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi is in China this week for a very important bilateral visit, as evidenced by the fact that he met with Premier Li Qiang, Foreign Minister Qin Gang, and his boss, top diplomat Wang Yi. Sino-Japanese relations are critical to follow for anyone interested in Asian developments generally. The two are the most powerful players in Asia and the second and third largest economies in the world respectively. This is the first visit by a Japanese foreign minister to China in more than 3 years. Tough words have been shared privately and publicly between the two sides. Wang Yi told him that difficulties in the bilateral relationship exist, quote, "whose fundamental cause is that some forces in Japan deliberately follow the erroneous China policy of the United States and cooperate with the US side to discredit China and make provocations on issues concerning China's core interests, which is short-sighted, wrong, and unwise." End quote. Once again, echoing the same idea we saw coming from PRC ambassador to the EU Fu Cong last week, that friction in China's many relationships with countries around the world, from Germany and the UK to South Korea and Australia, are primarily driven by a subservience to Washington, rather than indigenous concerns over PRC statements and behavior. In his meeting, China's new foreign minister, Qin Gang, said that a profound lesson from bilateral relations over the past half-century is that peaceful coexistence and friendly cooperation are the only correct choices for both sides, adding that he hopes Japan will, quote, "have a correct understanding of China, show political wisdom and courage, work with China to enhance dialogue and communication, promote practical cooperation, increase cultural and people-to-people exchanges, and properly manage differences, to remove obstacles and ease burdens for bilateral relations, and build a China-Japan relationship that meets the requirements of the new era." End quote. 3 major issues were raised: the discharge of nuclear-contaminated water from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant into the ocean, semiconductor controls, and of course, Taiwan. On the issue of Taiwan, we remember that Japan has a national security priority in ensuring the status quo. That is, not permitting mainland control over the island, as it would greatly undermine the safety of Japanese sea trade routes critical to food and energy importation, as well as make Japan much more vulnerable to Chinese attack. A long-running standoff over disputed islands in the East China Sea, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, also exists. On the issue of semiconductors, Qin Gang expressed, quote, "The US once brutally contained Japan's semiconductor industry by resorting to bullying practices. Today, the US has repeated its tricks on China. As the saying goes, Do not do unto others what you don't want done unto you. As the keenly felt pain still stings, Japan should not help a villain do evil. The blockade will only further stimulate China's determination for independence and self-development." End quote. On this theme, UK-based Japanese-owned Financial Times writes this week that semiconductor companies in China have been stockpiling key materials in anticipation of the Japanese export controls. A Japanese equipment distributor, who did not want to be named, told the outlet that they had rushed to ship orders to Chinese customers in anticipation of the ban coming into effect in the second half of this year. In his meeting, Premier Li Qiang expressed similar themes to his two colleagues. And on the Japanese side, Hayashi warned Beijing over its Russia military ties and demanded the release of a detained Japanese businessman accused of espionage, expressing, quote, "When conducting business and people-to-people exchanges, it is extremely important to have an environment where Japanese citizens and companies are able to conduct activities free from anxiety." End quote. Next up, the Chinese housing crisis. Hey guys, hope you're having a great Tuesday. If you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Sharing, subscribing is a huge help. And for those who can go the extra mile and be part of the community that keeps the channel sustainable, China Update relies primarily on subscriber support to keep going. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is the best way to keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Okay, and finally, the housing crisis. And we have the good, the bad, and the ugly to cover. Let's start with the good, or rather the optimistic. After months of strong and expensive state support, we have more evidence that the housing market's decline may have stabilized, with potential rebound, though it must be stressed that this is from a low base and that systemic issues remain in the wider sector. We note too that economists at ANZ Group said in a recent report that even if the property recovery continues with best case projections, annual sales will not reach more than 90% of pre-pandemic levels. Now let's look at the numbers, which as always we take with a grain of salt. According to a China Index Academy report on Sunday, in March, the average price of new residential buildings in 100 cities saw a month-on-month increase of 0.02%, a tiny movement, but a movement in the right direction. This is the first month-on-month increase in half a year. In another China Index Academy report published yesterday, Monday, new home sales rose sharply in March, again off very low bases. And as we have seen over recent months, an acute regional disparity is emerging. Tier 1 cities, including the nation's capital, Beijing, and the commercial hub of Shanghai, rose the fastest, jumping 73% last month. Sales in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities grew 54% and 28% respectively. According to preliminary data from China Real Estate Information Corp, published over the weekend, the value of new home sales by the 100 biggest real estate developers climbed 29.2% from a year earlier to approximately $96 billion. That compares with a 15% rise in February, the first increase in 20 months. On Monday, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, released its so-called survey report on urban household savers in the first quarter of 2023, which, among other things, showed that 17.5% of residents intend to purchase houses in the next 3 months, up from 16% in the fourth quarter of 2022. Quote, "Is the bottom in, at least in first-tier cities? If potential buyers think so, then there may be sharp increase in transactions in Tier 1 cities at least. If past cycles are still a guide now, no one wants to miss catching the bottom, and at least in top-tier cities, there is still real demand for housing." End quote. And on this particular point, now for the ugly. A major oversupply of unsold apartments. According to data provider Wind, China had 3.5 billion square meters of finished but unsold apartments in February, the equivalent of around 4 million homes, and likely the worst oversupply in China since 2017. According to property consulting firm China Real Estate Information Corp, around a third of all newly completed apartments in 2022 were unsold, the highest percentage since 2015, the last time China faced a housing crisis. A crisis which the government then, like now, just papered over, kicking the can of institutional reform down the road. Once again, regional disparities exist. The chronic oversupply is most acute in smaller cities with populations of a few million people or less. More than 640 third-tier cities, where demand is very weak, now have nearly 80% of China's total housing stock. If a catastrophic crash in the housing market was a potential bonfire, it is in these third-tier cities that we find the dry kindling. According to China Real Estate Information Corp, it takes about 6 years for a strong third-tier city to absorb its stock of unsold homes, compared with just 7 months in Shanghai. We should also compare this to the US, where nationally it has a 2.9-month supply of existing homes. Quote, "If China fails to stabilize home prices in its lower-tier cities, which are home to about 2/3 of China's urban population, it will likely damp household confidence and consumers' willingness to spend in many parts of the country, limiting the extent of China's overall economic recovery this year. In the longer run, the need to absorb the market's excess housing could mean a prolonged period of depressed new home construction, depriving China of one of its biggest growth drivers and job creators." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Have a wonderful day, everybody, wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.